From years of anxiety to warrior and mentor, Bradley Robinson created the Anxiety Project to help you end your anxiety naturally. Let's mold the new you and let's end anxiety together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anxiety Project podcast. Welcome to episode 316. I am Brad Robinson, and happy New Year, the first episode of the year. Here we go, starting the year off on the right foot with a sit-down conversation with Stephanie Hall. This is a good one. I really liked this because she specializes in Enneagrams, which is something I've never heard of. This is why I wanted to talk to her. I'm like, what the heck? Maybe, I have something to learn from this. Obviously, with everyone that I talk to, there is something to learn. So I'm very curious and I'm very, if you can help somebody, suffering from anxiety, suffering from depression, who's feeling lost, who wants to understand their personality, if they're too obsessive or they're too neurotic, they're too conscientious, this helps lay a map of who they are. And I thought this conversation was so useful. And there's so many there's so many fields you can take when you're looking to just better yourself. If you want to do a Jungian approach or a Freudian approach or a cognitive behavioral therapy approach or NLP approach, there's many different avenues, but it's really important to have some avenue, to pick one and maybe ground yourself in that foundation. And maybe the Enneagrams is something that you're interested in doing, and I highly recommend that you pick up her book, Enneagrams in Real Life. It is released this month, so go check it out. Stephanie Barron Hall is a coach, speaker, and certified Enneagram professional. She pulls from her undergraduate work in psychology as well as her master's work in organizational communication to create a unique approach to the Enneagram, relationships, and communication. So this is a good conversation. Let me know what you think by the end of the episode, and whether it's on Spotify or on the YouTube channel. And again, everyone, happy New Year. I'm excited about the year. I'm excited about the content that's going to come about this year. There's a lot of things that I want to do and continue to do on the YouTube side of things. So again, I hope you enjoy this. And without further ado, here is Stephanie Hall. Well, Stephanie, welcome to the Anxiety Project podcast. I'm really excited that you're here because, well, I was going over your book and there's so much about you that, well, we share a lot of commonalities. You're throwing out names like Bessel van der Kolk and trauma and James Clear and habits, and then you're just speaking all of my language. And for my audience out there, they're interested in the same thing because my podcast is all about anxiety, suffering, the meaning of life, what to do when you're stuck in a hole, right? Depression comes, anhedonia, the feeling of no emotion, and the depersonalization. So I'm really excited to have you on because not only we get to talk about all of that stuff, but also Enneagrams, which I'm not familiar with. So I guess, first of all, just a brief introduction of who you are, if you can provide the audience with that, and what really brought you into the sphere of psychology.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat about all of this as well. Um, it's funny. I kind of just fell into this in some ways, but it was also a thread that I could see throughout my life. So how I got into psychology is I was just fascinated by personality from when I was really young. As a child, I was like so curious. I think it's like a middle child syndrome thing, right? I'm like, I need to know why I feel like a weirdo in my family. And then in college, I studied psychology in undergrad. And I got inspired to work with people in teams using personality frameworks. Now, there's a lot of research at the time. Myers-Briggs was a big deal. There is a lot of research about the pros and cons of that, and I think that that's really important to consider. But I kind of started in that vein of being really inspired by that. I got a job and I actually was able to work with people. On our leadership team, we use a different personality structure framework, but I saw how well it helped us communicate with each other, because something about these frameworks is that it's not just about putting you in this box. It's more about helping you understand how you operate and how other people have a different kind of standard operation, right? And so understanding that we have those differences is one of the things that can help us communicate better, relate better, connect better, have these better social connections that are really the fabric of who we are as human beings, I think. And so I saw how powerful that was. And then that led me to the Enneagram. And so I kind of got into it. I was really curious, really interested. I started researching, I started posting about it on Instagram, of all places, and I just loved it. And then people started following me. And I went back to school and got more education so I could apply this further. And yeah, it's just been a journey.
That's fantastic. So with the personality knowledge that you've inherited by learning about this, is it true that we are born or we grow up with inherent personality traits, and that they can move along a spectrum, whereas you can be extroverted, but also you can be more introverted, but you can't necessarily get rid of the extroversion, but you can move along, whether you're really extreme or maybe a little moderate. But is that sort of correct?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different theories, but the current concept is that there are some personality traits that are heritable.
Right,
Um,
yeah.
However, we are very much meant to be adaptable creatures. And so there's a big part of it that's just the nurture. So people say nature or nurture all the time, and it's both. It really is both. Within the Enneagram space, we think of it as um, kind of like you're born with your type, and your type does not change throughout your life. That is the basic theory.
Right.
Now,
Right.
there are caveats to that, of course. But I think that with the Enneagram, it's a little bit different than other personality traits, because we're not looking at like, are you, neurotic, or are you conscientious? We're not looking at those things necessarily. We're looking at these core motivations that are swimming beneath the surface that often go unacknowledged until we start studying them.
Right, right. And when somebody comes to you who's interested, like myself, like we can even do that together. Like I come to you and I'm interested in more about this. Like, where do I start and how do I better understand the Enneagrams, and how does that help me better understand who I am?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that the Enneagram is a motivation-based personality system or framework. Now, I use the word personality there just because it's the closest approximation of what it is, but it actually is more about personal spiritual development. Um, and so that's the basic framework. And then there are 9 core motivations, and each of them is connected to a number or a type. So type 1, type 2, type 3, etc. Some people use monikers for them, like they might use the perfectionist or the reformer for type 1. I don't use those because I think that they can be really limiting for us as we're understanding ourselves, because it's just such a simplified way of looking at it. So I just use the numbers. And the first place to start is to understand those. So if you'd like, I can go through all 9
Yeah,
motivations.
please.
Okay. So I have to say, so there are 9 Enneagram types. And if you look at an Enneagram symbol, you'll see that there are 3 types at the top. Those are 8, 9, and 1 across the top. 9 is the very top one. On the right side, we have 2, 3, and 4. And on the left, we have 5, 6, and 7. When we break them apart, those are called intelligence centers. So we have body intelligence, 8, 9, and 1, heart intelligence, 2, 3, and 4, and mind intelligence 5, 6, and 7. And so I like that overlay because we see mind, heart, and body and all these other modalities as well. However, why I'm explaining this right now is because the Enneagram doesn't start with type 1. It starts with type 8. So I will start with type 8 and go around the circle. So
why start at 8?
Because I like to keep the intelligence centers together, and because 1 is the last number in one of them, then you can't start with that one, because then you'll start with one body type and then go back and finish the body types.
Okay.
I suppose you can start with 2 if you'd like.
Okay.
Or 5, but I like to keep them in order. Right. So in the body center, we have type 8. They are motivated by need to be against. And it's not to be against just to be contrarian for contrarian's sake, but they kind of believe that there's this truth that they have to find that's not being said. And they really value honesty and transparency and straightforwardness. They have a really tough exterior, but if you know an 8 really well, they have like this soft, tender inside. Type 9 is motivated by the need to be at peace internally and externally. And they have this way of keeping the outside world out and the inside world in. And they find this nice, cozy, comfortable space to be in. They're very accepting and accommodating and kind people. And they also sometimes fall asleep to themselves and don't really understand what they want or need from life. Type 1 is motivated by the need to improve and be good, right, and correct. And it's not about being good at things, but it's about being morally and ethically good according to their own moral compass. So those are our body types. Then we have the heart types, which are 2, 3, and 4. They're more focused on relationships and image. They care a lot about, how other people perceive them. So 2s are motivated by this need to be loved and wanted and needed. So they do anything that they possibly can to be indispensable to others. And they're very kind and warm people. Like, know them as the person who always shows up and helps you. Not always like tangible help, but it can also be the positive rapport and positive relational support that they offer. 3s are motivated by a need to be successful and to be admired. And so they really are motivated to excel and succeed. And for 3s, they always kind of think there's more that they could do, and they are petrified of failure because they believe that if they slow down or stop, they'll be worthless. Then we have, and by the way, I will say for 3s, it can be a tricky one to figure out if you're a 3, because that is kind of how the culture of the United States in general has been for a long time, right? Of like hustle.
Yeah, just to pause on that, the hustling part, I resonate with a few of these, because when in my 20s, the reason why I started this podcast and the coaching was because I suffered from an extreme anxiety disorder, right? It extended up to agoraphobia, where I couldn't even leave my house. And that was late 20s. And the reason, because you were talking about that hustle, I think of Freud's superego pressing down on and then the id pressing up, whereas all of my impulsive tendencies, like hedonic pursuits, sex and drugs, and just trying to rise to some sort of fame and attention, being that young age, the Andrew Tate type figure, and then the superego of culture pressing down, saying, go to school, you should have a job by this time, you should have a family by this time. And I felt like it was crushing me to the point I was like Captain Hook. I was running away from the crocodile with the clock in its stomach, right? Time was chasing me, the dragon of chaos. I was willfully blind to kind of like my impulses, as well as that pressure above me. And to get out of that was to actually confront time, right? To confront, like, hey, I could use this time. It was kind of like I needed a kind of overarching framework, a narrative to follow, right? Because it was like I could adopt all of this responsibility, like of my suffering, and then I could progress outwards to something better. And it like by realizing like, hey, like I could I could change. Like if I looked inwards, I could actually, instead of relying on other people, I could actually do the work and actually recover from this. And it was a very, very big relief. When you're talking about that pressure, the of like time chasing you, I just thought about that, and I think that's super important for people to understand.
Yeah. And I think what can be really hard for threes is I see a lot that they get to their late 30s and they're like,
Yeah.
wow, I've been in this job and excelling my whole life, and I've never thought about, do I even like this job?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for fours, they're motivated by this need to find and express their truest identity, their true heart, who they truly are. And they are like plumbing the depths of their psyche, trying to understand more and more and more. And they're very emotionally attuned to themselves. And they can be emotionally attuned to others, though not all fours really resonate with that. And they are very much focused on kind of going inward and studying their rich internal landscape. Now we have our mind types or head types, and these are more focused on strategy and understanding how things work, and they want to understand what's the model. So fives are motivated by this need to be self-sufficient and competent. They are tend to be introverted. This is the only one where I really do kind of ascribe one of those terms. They tend to be introverted. They're very cerebral. They look at data and facts, and they kind of break everything down into its disparate parts, so that they can analyze and understand what they think about things without actually having to go deep into the feeling, because feelings territory is really uncomfortable for them.
Right.
Sixes are motivated by this need to be safe and secure, and the thing that they want most is certainty. They don't like to feel uncertain, but certainty is elusive, because the closer you get to it, the more that you're like, there just could be this higher level of certainty that I could achieve. So they tend to struggle a lot with anxiety. Now, any type can be anxious, any type can be depressed, but sixes have more of this like existential kind of wariness that things are going to fall apart. I described it recently because type sevens, who we'll talk about next, are very glass half full people. And I described a 6 to a 7 as sixes can believe the glass is half full, but they just are aware that the glass could shatter. So they kind of always keep that in mind.
So what is it about the sixes that make them so existentially like on edge, I guess you can say, or like in that frame?
Yeah, they have a lot of questions. They don't trust that things are exactly as they are.
Right.
And
could it be related to conscientiousness?
I think that sixes are, I would have to think about that a little bit more. I know most sixes, when they do the ocean assessments, they score really high on neuroticism.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
But not always. I mean, I'm sure that there are other examples of that, because these aren't like perfect compatible, assessments. But sixes can be very conscientious. At other times, they might be more like, I'm just going to scare the fear away by, not letting it touch me, not letting it conquer me. So I have literally had sixes in, I do a lot of work in corporate spaces, so workshops and with teams and everything. And I've had sixes say, I am terrified of heights, so I go skydiving, or I go bungee jumping.
They confront it.
So that is like a certain type of six. Interesting. I also had another six say, every night when I go to bed, instead of thinking about counting sheep or whatever, I think through everything that could go wrong and how I would mitigate it.
That's
So it's like
powerful.
making like decision trees in their heads.
That's really good. You know, it's something I coach with my clients to do if they have like a recital or like a concert, or if they have like even anything like a dentist appointment they're nervous about where they got to get a needle or something. I always say, well, let's go through the event in your mind and how you would like it to go. Like would it look like for you to actually go through it, and on the other side of that you leave, and how do you feel? You feel confident? Do you feel like you accomplished something that was beyond you, that was plaguing you? And even if it's just planning something for the future, a lot of people don't want to attend to making a dentist appointment or like scheduling in something, or because it's just something it's just resistant to them. And so like
Hmm.
even if just thinking about planning something can really help them. So I love that. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And I think for a
Yeah.
lot of sixes, it can be helpful to just say, well, and then what? And go through
Mm,
all of the worst case scenarios and recognize
yep.
that they do have the tools to manage them.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So then we have sevens who are very glass half full, like life is full of possibilities. They are motivated by the need to be free to explore the world and without limitations. They really hate limitations being placed on them. And so they can have a bit of a hedonistic streak,
Mm,
and they just explore they enjoy life. They can be very serious about their work, but they still want to just make the most of it and explore. And find life thrilling and positive and fun and interesting. And so that's type 7. So those are the 9 types.
mm. That's so interesting because I relate to each one of them, but also relate more to the existential for me, neurotic. That's more of what, and
Sure.
I what I relate is also like we've talking earlier how the mind is plastic and how we can definitely move along this spectrum of yeah, sure, you can have these neurotic traits, but you can also make the right sacrifices in your life to get it to a place more of comfort, security, um, predictable, right? And so
Hmm.
that's really interesting. And do these overlap? Like you can have a 1 and a 3 and a
So no. So
no.
there you have one core type. There are people who
Interesting.
use this other concept called tri-type, or
Mm,
sometimes people use a bit of a variation on that called trifix.
mm,
Um,
mm,
Actually, tri-type is a derivative of trifix, but whatever, that's a technical thing. But
mm,
um, however, I don't teach that because I teach something else, which is called subtypes. So
mm,
within each of the types, there are 3 subtypes.
mhm.
And that actually helps you hone in on your type. And also, it
Interesting.
helps you understand what is the exact growth path for me in my subtype.
Right.
Um, so you have one core type and a subtype of that core type.
Mm,
And then sometimes people look at the wings as sort of subtypes. I kind of think of the wings as growth stretches. And what I mean by wings is the adjacent types to your core type. So, say you're type 6, then the wings would be 5 and 7. And there are a lot of
mm,
other technical pieces of it that definitely, if anyone's interested, this is all laid out in the book that in a lot more detail.
mhm.
But you can look at the diagram of the Enneagram, even if you just Google it right now, and you'll see that all the types are connected across the triangles and across, the diagram. And
Mhm.
those are what we call arrow lines.
Mm,
So that is one of the ways that you'll find connection with the other types
mm.
as well.
Interesting. What transformations have you seen working with people, and how could this be useful figuring out what your type is, and how can this bring about more of an enlightened mind, I
Hmm.
suppose?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I see is people will say, I've gotten this feedback my entire life. Like the type 1 at work, they've gotten the feedback their entire lives that they
Right.
are too perfectionistic or too hard on themselves. Ones have a vicious inner critic, and
Mm,
it can be really, really challenging. Now, in general, every type can have an inner critic, but ones are particularly vicious, and it really tells them, you're terrible, you should have done this, you should have done that, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Um, and once they learn the Enneagram, then they start recognizing, oh, like I don't have to operate in that way. I can work with my inner critic and say, hey, thanks for letting me know. I don't need that feedback right now. Or,
Right.
I've got this. I kind of teach some of those methods. If you've read Chatter by Ethan Kross, I think he has a lot of great methods for working with the inner critic. I'm not a fan of the guidance to say, just shut up. Doesn't really work for most people. So,
You're more so like Freud, like Jung, where he'd be like, question it, look into it. If it's something that's like, causing you negative emotion, there's something deeper there, like a deeper meaning. Instead of like saying shut up, what does this mean more so? Are you
mhm.
more like that kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also to say, what do I need from this?
Right.
And what do I not? And
Hmm.
it really helps ones to reevaluate what their priorities are and what's really important. So I've seen ones who are really stuck in this inner critic space, then be able to just relax and rest. And even though not everything in their house is organized or um, completely decluttered or something, they can just be in the space and rest and relax and allow themselves to decompress a little bit. Um, Even if there are still things on their to-do list and it's just an intentional choice that they make and they have that spaciousness about it, which I think is really fantastic because it can be so hard for ones to rest if they're not on vacation.
Right.
On vacation, ones are like, all right, let's go, let's just relax. Um, but when they're at home, there's always something more to do. So I've seen that. I've also heard from employees of leaders I've worked with who come in and say, our leader learned that she's a 3. And now she's so much more understanding when we don't work at the same pace that she wants us to, or when we have questions or we want to dive deeper and be more thorough, because 3s love the bottom line. It's not that they don't want to be thorough. It's just that they're like, let's just get it done if we can get it done. Right.
Right.
And so this 3 did not realize that she was pushing her employees to burnout because of how much she expected of them and how quickly she expected it to be done. And the quality of their work improved, and the quality of their work life also improved.
Right. And with yourself, what I mean, as you're talking about this, I realize that it's bringing a lot of unconscious processes up to the surface and making
Yeah.
them known to somebody.
Hmm.
And I think that's exactly right. I think, especially when I was suffering and, I'm reading a lot of Jung, I understand now, at the time, which I didn't understand, that I was being controlled by all of these processes. Like they're so way more sophisticated than my rational conscious mind, and
Hmm.
and by bringing them to light and questioning them and understanding, the reasons why you think and behave and, tend to certain, what would you say, biases, unconscious biases, that really opens the door for a plan forward. Without the plan, you're kind of left in this fog of the unknown.
Hmm.
And how has this helped you? Like when you applied it to yourself, what were the big revelations that you've had with this?
Yeah, I'll tell you about one in particular, which I wrote about this briefly in the book as well. Um, but I remember I was first learning about the Enneagram my mid-20s, and um sorry, I just had a blank of realizing how long ago that was. um I was driving to work one day, and at the time I lived in Southern California, so I had a 25-mile commute, which was like an hour, or an hour and a half. And I I just noticed myself reaching for the radio dial and turning it up.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't even want to listen to this.
Yeah.
Why did I do that? And I was like, oh, I'm having like this ick feeling,
Hmm.
like something is uncomfortable. And so I kind of like thought about it for the rest of my drive. And I realized like, okay, I'm feeling anxiety. Okay, I'm like, it's a feeling. Like there's this feeling that's under the surface that wants to come out, but I don't want to deal with it. So I'm going to just turn up the radio and not deal with it. And that was kind of the start of when I was learning the Enneagram. And I had never realized before that I was so reluctant to feel my feelings. And so it's been this huge, long journey of tapping into emotion and learning how to feel it and learning how to process it because a lot of my other biggest struggles, um, like procrastination and perfectionism, if you read some of the scholars on those, you know, coping mechanisms, like Tim Pitchell or Fuchsia Sirois, both of them will say that procrastination and perfectionism come from like not being able to process your emotions. Like
Right.
that's kind of the root of those. And so it's just it made me realize like, oh, this is kind of a core problem underneath the surface. And I I resonate most with type 3. And one of the ways that that plays out for me is in that I can be bright and shiny and like make everyone, I guess, impressed, but at what cost, right? And the cost is truly knowing and understanding myself. So a big part of this journey for me has been realigning with who am I? What do I really want from life? What do I really want from my career or my relationships or what's most important to me and finding kind of that thread to be more of my values versus whatever everyone else wants from me, which is a lot easier for me to do.
Right. So you're bringing stuff out of, I guess, the shadow elements of the psyche, what Jung would describe. Like for someone who's, who grows up with aggressive parents, overly aggressive, they learn to not want that and they become too agreeable or they become too agreeable, people pleasing, right? And they grow up and they don't integrate the positive aspect of the aggression because when they grew up, they saw the negative and they're like, no, there's only one side to aggression. I don't ever want to harness that. And so it's useful, like the Enneagram helps even in that regard where you can be like, well, maybe I can integrate this that hasn't been integrated yet into my
Right.
personality.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the way that we speak about it is the similar, the Jungian ways that you're kind of bringing into this. That's the way that we speak about personality within the Enneagram is
Brilliant.
the stereotypical kind of mid-level or unhealthy spaces that most of us live in because I mean, we have to survive and we have these structures and these coping mechanisms that we use to survive. And those are very unconscious. So part of the work of the Enneagram is to become more conscious of what are those factors, what are those forces, bringing those to the surface, like you're saying, and recognizing, okay, how do I move forward into the way that I want? So I don't have to go in this very type 5 way of being. I can choose the way that is going to work for me or lead to my highest, kind of enlightenment or highest good and for the highest good of the people around me. Now, that is a lot easier said than done.
Yep, indeed.
um, but it's lifelong work, I think.
Yes, yes. How would you go about helping somebody, like being on this topic with the existential numbers that you've mentioned of the Enneagram? And I think you've also connected that with more being neurotic. What would you integrate in helping somebody in that area?
Yeah. So I think the numbers that kind of fall into that space are 4, 5, and 6, probably the most.
Mm,
And some of the things that I would think about with that person are how do you develop self trust, right?
right.
So
Yep.
um, that can be really tricky in terms of like just the self efficacy for different reasons. So fours, um, and fives, well, actually, all these types, they're big fans of thinking about things and feeling about them too, especially fours feel about them too. But the action piece can be really difficult to just push themselves into, okay, I'm going to do it now. So I was working with a five who spent 6 or 8 months researching what microwave to get, and then they didn't end up buying one.
Right. Right.
Because it's just too much information. Um, Fives can handle a lot of information, but it's like there's no perfect solution. So they just didn't buy one.
So would you say they don't, it's hard for them to take a leap of faith?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Because when you don't have the self-trust, then it's scary. And what's hard about self-trust is if you don't ever take a leap of faith, then you don't ever prove to yourself that you can.
Right. Right.
So one six I've worked with for the last year and a half has been saying, I'm going to finish my resume and I'm going to get a new job. But that takes a lot of effort, and a lot of like sixes can rethink at every little moment. And so they play out like, well, it could be way worse than the job that I have now. Maybe I should just stay here because I don't know what that's going to be like. And sixes are very loyal, so they expect to be rewarded for loyalty. And they fear being disloyal. So those are some of the first ways. I often tell them, shorten your timelines. So go ahead and move forward. I will say with that one, sometimes fours can be impulsive. So what I want fours to do is to recognize I have agency in my life. Like I can do something different. I can write a different story. I can help myself. I don't have to rely on others to help me. But for fives and sixes, shorten their timelines. You know, they say, okay, next year I'm going to start writing a novel. I'm like, start today. Just write a few things down. Guess what? Writing a book takes a heck of a lot longer than you think it will. So yeah, I think that can be a really powerful thing for them.
Yeah. And one of the useful things I learned from my mentors is, it's better to start, but keep in mind that the intention is to do it badly. Do a very bad job, but do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of was a relief to me. It's like I don't have to really worry about punctuation. I don't have to worry about. It's like it's about. I think James Clear talked about this in his book, where to get the guy to go to the gym, he had to like show up for like a couple minutes or 5 minutes, walk in the door and walk out of the gym and make that the habit, right? But do a bad job. It's about, I guess, setting the momentum and showing yourself that you could really.
Yeah.
So that's really useful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think I really feel for these types too, because I tend to veer to the opposite side of the spectrum. It's changed a little bit in the past few years, but I used to be very much a type of person who would just be, I'm just going to do this. And my husband, who is type 6, would be like, why do you think you can do that? Like, and I'm like, I don't know, because I want to. Like, what? And so now I'm a little bit more balanced, but yeah, I think it can be really challenging to feel so stuck.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I guess a side note is, what would you say to someone who does feel stuck, who feels like they don't know where they're going, they don't even know, they're looking for some sort of meaning, purpose, and what have you learned with that in your own life? But what would you say to help someone in that area?
Yeah, I think it would really depend on their type.
Right.
So that would be the first thing. But I think the types that struggle the most with like meaning in this question of who am I are typically the heart types. Some types don't ever think about who am I. But the heart types are constantly thinking about that. So I think going back to feeling their own feelings, and I like a really values based approach to that. So, what do you value? And what would it look like for your life to align with that? And for it to be meaningful in that sense.
Right.
And I think that that can work for other types. I know some sixes um, have those questions as well, like, what is my purpose? Um, and I think the other type that can struggle with this a lot is type nines. They tend to get really stuck because they just don't believe that they're very important.
Mm.
Or they don't believe that they're as important as everyone else. And they kind of just try to make life good for everyone. And then by doing that, they make it good for themselves as well. If I include everyone, then I'm going to be included,
Right.
is kind of the thought process.
Mm-hmm.
But nines just have a really hard time working toward anything that's for their own end, or for their own betterment or for their own goals. So with that, I really like to use kind of a buddy system for nines to say, hey, work with this other person who is this other type. Or, um, I'll mention writing a book again. Go work in a group of people who you're all writing together and you're all struggling together. And that is a really powerful tool because it helps nines see, okay, you're not alone. And
Mm-hmm.
also it gives you the momentum or that push that you need to get started. Because that is the most difficult thing for nines to do.
Right. Right. Um, Being a coach myself, I've noticed that there there are different there are different people that connect with different, what would you say, uh, uh, maps to progress forward. Like some would be more Jungian, some like who like recognize more of like the archetypes, or someone who are more connected with more the spiritual, the meditation, or someone who's connected to CBT or NLP, which all have their place, or Freudian, or Carl Rogers is another one where he's interesting. What I learned from him is that people, what helps people is walking, like just talking out their their life and being a listener, and that's also Freud too. But Rogers also recognized that the person has to want to change in order for any change to even occur. But
Mm-hmm.
where I was going with this is most of my clients are Jungian because of how I am on YouTube and the podcast. I'm more open. I'm more archetypes. I'm more story. I'm more biblical, and I talk about Harry Potter a lot and Lord of the Rings, and I connect that to like all of CBT, and I try and bridge this gap, like a lot of current day psychologists try and do, especially like Piaget. But I don't know. Are you interested in those psychologists as well? And do you kind of integrate a bunch of stuff and as you're teaching people the Enneagrams, it's all in the same sphere, I
Yeah.
suppose.
I mean, there are certainly elements of all these different things.
Right.
However, I haven't really read as much about those psychologists since undergrad, so it's been a
Yeah,
long
yeah,
time.
yeah.
Um, and I do really like, if you want to talk personality psychology, I like Brian Little.
Hmm.
And it's funny because he doesn't like things like the Enneagram, but that's fine with me because
Right,
I'm a
right.
skeptic, right?
Me
I
too.
am
Me
like,
too.
is this really a thing?
Yeah.
But then I go and I work with teams and I have people who are like, oh, these personality things are so stupid. I hate them. And then they get their results and they're like,
Yeah, 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 yeah. Me too.
like I
Yeah,
feel so seen. And so I'm
me
like,
too.
okay, it does work.
Yeah.
But he talks a lot about personality as like a personal project.
Right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
your quote unquote personality is really about what you are actively doing in your life at the moment. So if I'm somebody who's super motivated and ambitious and I'm not doing that right now, well, I'm not going to see motivated and ambitious in my daily life. So like, what is my personality in my daily life? Um,
Right.
so I don't bring as much of those in. However, a lot of the what I do teach, especially in corporate, is grounded in a lot of communication theories, and thinking about those as kind of the underlying concepts, because I think I mean, the study of communication is very interdisciplinary. So you've got psychologists and philosophers and all these different people, sociologists. But I bring a lot of that into the way that I teach in corporate spaces.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, I think, because I've bounced around personally just by what the struggles I've experienced. Like I would jump from CBT, oh, it worked. Some of this worked, some of this didn't work. And then I jumped to NLP, some of this worked. And then, you jump to Freud and jump to, so I'm like that. I'm like very open. I believe something like this, the Enneagram, yeah, it's the same kind of idea where, this will help someone map out kind of the fog that they're in, right? It brings all this stuff up from their unconscious that they didn't realize before. It's then very
Mm-hmm.
enlightening and helps them integrate it and ask the right questions and kind of make a plan forward. No, it's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. And like you said, the work that I do is about trying to make the unconscious conscious,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And not to necessarily always get rid of it, but just to understand that these are the forces, because when we're unaware, that's when we get ourselves into trouble. That's when we get ourselves stuck in these ruts or we miscommunicate.
Yeah.
Like an example that I always give is, if I'm the type of person who gets really quiet when I'm angry and I go into a work
Me
meeting
too.
and
Me
somebody
too.
else is quiet, which by the way,
Yeah.
I'm not that type of person.
I am. I am.
Yeah, okay, so
Yeah.
you can feel that. So
Yep.
say you go into a work meeting and
Yep.
somebody else is really quiet.
Yep.
Well, then you start to think they're angry.
Yep.
So you're applying your motivation to their behavior instead of being curious, which the Enneagram invites us to be curious about our own motivations and others.
Yes.
So you might not realize, but if you're assuming that they're angry, you might start treating them like, you might be a little bit defensive, or you might be tiptoeing, or you might, um, kind of nitpick, or these different things, because you're operating on some assumption. But they might be tired, they might be thinking, they might be sick, they might have something going on personally,
Right. Right.
all these other things. And so when we stop applying our motivation to their behavior, then we can be more curious about what's actually happening for them. And we don't get into those unintentional miscommunication spats that happen in our daily lives, even though we try to be emotionally mature individuals who don't do that at work, but people do it, right? So I think it's really important to have some sort of mechanism to help you not do that. And the Enneagram is an excellent tool to help kind of get out of that mode of operating, and to try something different.
Right. Right. When does the book come out?
January 28th.
So you must be really excited.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's a harried like race to the finish here.
Yeah. Right.
But
Right.
I've been working on it for over 2 years, so
Wow. How was that process? It must have
harrowing.
harrowing. Right. Right. So it must have. I mean, it's a topic that you hold dear to yourself, but at the same time, harrowing. Like it's just an uphill Sisyphus story battle.
Right.
Right.
I think the thing I found most challenging was that it was really important to me. So I've been doing this on Instagram for a long time, since 2018. And so I I know that if you don't apply the same treatment to every type, that people get upset, right? And I understand that. They don't want somebody to get preferential treatment.
Mhm.
So what I mean by the same treatment is like the same categories, the same headings, the same number of words, all those sorts of things, right?
Mhm.
So I tried so hard to make the structure of all the content very cookie cutter, so that even though the content is different within each type, of course, it's all like, it all feels the same for each type. And that was the most challenging part, simply because it's so long. It's 80,000 words. Um, and it's just really difficult, I think, to break everything out in that way. So I would turn it in and then I'd get it back and then I'd be like, okay, I'm going to rewrite this whole section, pull it out for all 9 types, rewrite all of them together and put it back in the manuscript. And I did that multiple times for each of the sections. So that was the most challenging part.
Right. And I went through the book and I noticed there's parts where you lay out the questions to determine your type. Like you're going to grow as you read this because it's applicable, right? We're working with it and you're discovering more about who you are. So you're answering the questions, you lay it out. I think there's charts in there, there's questions that you answer. No, it's fantastic. It's really great. Yeah, I highly recommend.
Thanks
everyone.
so much. And I think the thing that I would say for now too is if you're curious, you can also go on my website and I also have a guide to finding your type that is somewhat similar to what you'll find in the book. But if you want to get started now, then you can find that there as well.
Fantastic. And where's your website?
It's 9types.co.
Well, Stephanie, I think that's a great place to stop. I really appreciate your time, and I highly recommend everyone to check out this book, Enneagram in Real Life. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fun.
It was a pleasure.
Brad's powerful anxiety recovery program is now available at unpluganxiety.com. The Anxiety Project program is downloadable and puts the power of anxiety recovery in your own hands. Visit unpluganxiety.com for more details. Recovery starts now.